freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. As always, I am your host, Nico Perino, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Sean Stevens. He's a first-time guest on the podcast, and he is FIRE's Senior Research Fellow in Polling and Analytics, and we are going to discuss our just-released 2020 College Free Speech ranking. Sean, welcome onto the show.
Thanks for having me, Nico. Happy to be here.
So this is Wednesday. We released the rankings yesterday. It's a project, I looked at my calendar, that we've been working on since, well, we had our first big meeting on May 3rd of 2019. We'd been kind of talking about it in one-on-one conversations and over email before that, but we first got together with the big group that worked on this project on May 3rd. And then we later brought in College Pulse, which was our polling analytics company, they actually administered the survey, and they helped us with the one big question we had on May 3rd, which was, how do you rank a bunch of different colleges across the country? How do you rank their free speech climates by polling students on those individual campuses about their attitudes and thoughts about the climates? You know, one of the ways to do it is to ask the colleges to give you access to their students to interview or survey them. But colleges for a project like this aren't going to be too inclined to give you access to their data, and that would be a huge undertaking, a huge process, and probably involve a lot of negotiation with the colleges. But College Pulse is this unique company that has a panel of college students, thousands, hundreds of thousands of college students across the country, with significant enough samples on a number of campuses that you can then poll these students, ask them about their attitudes about free speech, ask them about the climate for free speech on their campus, and get a result that you can then do a statistical analysis of. And that was something that we didn't have for years. I mean, it's really only something that with College Pulse has become available to people that want to poll college students in the last couple of years. So it's really exciting. And the poll was meant to answer one simple question, which was, what are the best colleges for free speech in America? We always been able to rate their speech codes because we have lawyers on staff who comb through the Student Codes Handbook and other policies at these colleges and rate those policies for First Amendment compliance. Of course, public universities are required by law to follow the First Amendment. Private universities that promise free expression, we rate their policies on a First Amendment standard. But that's all we were really able to do. And then we, of course, had anecdotal evidence about cases we had at schools, but we didn't really have a way to systematically analyze what students think about the climate for free speech on their campus, so that when prospective students asked us about a school, or their parents for that matter, we didn't have a scientific analysis to really show them aside from the spotlight rating. So that's why we're really excited about this survey. It's the largest ever survey of college students on their attitudes about free speech that has ever been conducted. The survey was fielded from April 1st to May 28th and had a sample of 19,969 undergraduates at the 55 college campuses that we rated. You know, Sean, I should say a few things about the survey that some of our listeners might be wondering. We did close the survey before the George Floyd protests started at the end of May, so some of the student attitudes that might have changed since those protests aren't reflected in the data here. And then there's the coronavirus, of course, which is the weird variable. The coronavirus landed, a lot of things started shutting down in March. So this was fielded, this survey, after the coronavirus had happened. Many colleges had already sent their students home. But I should note that all of the students that we surveyed had some experience in a classroom on campus when this survey was fielded, insofar as they can remember what it was like, even if they weren't on campus. And then, of course, they had their experiences with online speech and instruction. In College Pulse, we asked them, we're doing this, they didn't see any strong divergence in the data collected for all of the surveys that they done as a result of the coronavirus. So we felt pretty good about that. So yeah, it's exciting stuff. Sean, do you think we should give our listeners the rankings?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's real exciting. Like you said, it's been basically a year and a half in development and analysis, etc. So it's nice to be on the other side of it finally.
Yeah, and we hope to do it again and expand it to more than 55 colleges in the future. But of the 55 colleges that we ranked for, or that we surveyed students for, number 1, University of Chicago, which didn't really come as a surprise to us, did it, Sean?
No, it didn't. Their president has long been very vocal in public about the university's support for free speech and free expression. And the tradition there goes back even longer than, the last 5 to 10 years. So it really did not come as a surprise.
Yeah, it's kind of a proof of concept. This is a college, or a university, I should say, that has, as you said, been very vocal about its commitment to free expression. It had, of course, the Chicago Statement, which dozens of universities have gone on to adopt, that really doubled down on its commitment to allowing all speech to occur on campus, regardless of how controversial it might be. So, it receives FIRE's green light rating for free speech protective policies, and that's one of the factors that goes into these rankings. And we'll talk a little bit about that more later, but students seem to have gotten the message. They've gotten the message that their administration supports the free expression ideas, and they, to a certain extent, feel more comfortable than a lot of these other schools, these students, in expressing themselves.
Yeah, and I would emphasize on those 2 points, actually, that in our data and in the survey, we asked 2 questions about student perceptions on how much the administration supports free speech, free expression. And at the University of Chicago, the figures were basically at 90% for both. 90% for one of them, 88% for the other. So it's very clear that the students have received the message from the administration. Most of the other schools did not hit percentages at that level.
So the other top schools: number 2, Kansas State; number 3, Texas A&M; 4, UCLA; 5, Arizona State. Coming in at number 6, we have University of Virginia, then Duke, then Virginia Tech. At 9, we have Brown, which is an interesting school, right, Sean?
Yeah, it's
the only Ivy League in the top 10.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that one was probably the biggest surprise out of schools in the top 10. Brown's ranking is one of the reasons. It's not the sole reason, but it's one of the reasons we decided to dig a bit deeper into the data and ultimately came up with the idea of producing an overall rank and then ranking the school based on what liberal students said and conservative students said. In our dashboard, we've kind of expanded that, and you can see kind of a bunch of different demographic categories with the ranking system. But our
yeah, and you can view all these rankings and sort them by different variables at speech.collegepulse.com, and 2 of the variables you're talking about, Sean, are ranked by liberals and ranked by conservatives, because we thought that there might be echo chambers on some of these campuses, which allow students to feel freer in expressing themselves. But that's obviously not something we want. And so Brown, which ranks number 9 on the overall, when you factor in all the students, actually, when you ask just conservatives about the environment at Brown, they come in at 35th.
Yeah, and they come in again at the top, in the top 10 for liberals. I think they're like 5th or 6th or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head where they are on that list, but they come in strongly overall. They come in very strongly with the liberals, and they don't do very well with conservatives. And then as we dig a little deeper into the data, we can discover that in terms of self-identified and self-reported political ideology, Brown had the highest percentage of students that identified as liberal. And they had one of the lowest percentages identifying as conservative. So it's a very homogenous community. And so as Nico, as you said, it seems like the over 80% of liberal students that occupy Brown's campus feel quite comfortable discussing ideas, presumably with each other. But the small minority that don't fit in that category don't seem to feel the same way. They seem to have a different experience on campus.
One of the other variables that people who visit the dashboard at speech.collegepulse.com can see is the rankings of the schools by ideological diversity. And as you said, Sean, Brown doesn't perform well. In fact, it performs worst. It's number 55 for ideological diversity in our rankings for ideological diversity. The student population there is overwhelmingly liberal, and that can create an echo chamber, a monoculture. If everyone around you thinks the same way as you do, you're probably going to feel more comfortable expressing what you believe. I should note that coming in at the top of ideological diversity with 34% liberal students, 34% moderate, and 31% conservative is Penn State, Pennsylvania State University. And I should note, my ego here, Indiana University, my alma mater, comes in at number 4. And I do remember it being a campus with a lot of ideological diversity. It doesn't perform as well in the overall rankings. I think it's in the middle of the pack. Yeah, it's in the top 20. It's number 18. But some really interesting stuff to sort through there in ideological diversity is when we also rank the schools by women and men, how they responded to the questions, racial minorities, and then we have a Trump approval category there. So rounding out the top 10 then is the University of Arizona. So those are your top 10. I'm going to skip now to the bottom, all the stuff in the middle. I'm going to just encourage people who are listening to go to the rankings again, speech.collegepulse.com to look at those. But at the bottom 10, we have at, what is that? That would be 46
through 55.
Yeah. So that would be University of South Carolina. And then you have Harvard. Harvard is a college that has always kind of been on fire's list. They seem to have a free speech controversy, or in recent memory, a due process controversy every year. And is always kind of in the running for consideration in our worst colleges for free speech list that we put out in January, February of every year. So it wasn't any surprise that they landed on this list. They also have a red light speech code rating. And then we have Wake Forest coming in at 47. Then Georgetown, like Harvard, is always on our list. Brigham Young University at 49. Sean, you want to talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, they're a very interesting comparison school for something like Brown. In that, I think we're not at Fire. We're not surprised that BYU did badly overall. They're the only school that we surveyed that actually has a warning rating, which is worse than a red light rating.
Well, so it's a rating that we give to colleges, often sectarian religious schools, that just don't give students any free speech promises. They're private schools. They can value things above free expression. It's their free association right to place, in this case, certain religious values associated with the Church of Latter-day Saints, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, above free expression. So they get a warning rating from Fire, and it's they're taking advantage. They're a private school. They don't have to abide by the First Amendment if they don't want to, and so they make it clear that they really don't intend to the students. And so, I don't think any of us were very surprised to see them low in the overall rankings. They were dead last when looking at just liberals. And that's not surprising, I think, at all. But they wound up ranked 4th for conservatives. And so just like Brown, this was kind of, once we kind of did these sub-rankings, it became clearer that something to do with the ideological makeup of the campus is an important factor in how students experience it. BYU was the only campus where over 50% of students identified as conservative. And it had the lowest percentage overall of students identifying as liberal. And so it's not necessarily the mirror image of Brown, because the percentage of conservative students was, between 55 and 60%, if I remember correctly from off the top of my head, and the percentage of liberal students was around 30. And so at Brown, it's more like an 80-10 split. So the split isn't as big, but, when you kind of go through the data, you go through some of these open-ended responses that we also received to a question about self-censorship, you see kind of almost mirror image comments. So conservatives at Brown, really feel stifled, etc. And liberals at BYU essentially express the same types of feelings about the expression environment. And if you go to these schools' pages, when you go to the rankings, you'll be able to click on the school and it'll take you in depth about that school. And there's a section on each school's landing page called Student Voices that's, actually really interesting. It's kind of an endless scroll. It's how students responded to open-ended questions about the environment for free expression on their campus. And if you really want to do a deep dive, and I'm sure there could be some sort of a meta-analysis, and probably will be one that's done at some point, some kind of qualitative analysis, you can do that. And it also lists, we don't want to provide personally identifiable information about the students, but it does tell you their class year. So there's some interesting stuff there.
Yeah, with those, there's a few quotes we removed simply because they were quite personal, and clearly, if someone wanted to do a little digging, they could identify who the student was. So we removed those, and a handful of others that kind of didn't really address the question. But overall, there's over 5,000 of these open-ended responses, and they largely they really go with the conclusions in the report, and they just kind of flesh it out and paint a much richer picture. And so I would encourage people, if you have the time, to kind of scroll through some of those because they're pretty interesting.
So let's talk about the factors or kind of the methodology that went into ranking these schools. So we had about, I think it was 26 questions that we asked every student. And then we created an index based on the responses to those questions that kind of broke them down by categories and gave them a weight. So one of the categories, which receives 40 points out of the 100 that each school could earn, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Sean, you're the data wizard, was tolerance.
Yeah, so schools can get up to 40 points for tolerance. So they can have a 0 on it, and they can get a maximum of 40. And so the way we measure tolerance is this very standard way from political science, political psychology, public opinion research that's been around since the 1950s with Samuel Stouffer's work. Effectively, we presented a handful of speakers indicating kind of what they intended to speak about. Most of these ideas were fairly controversial. A few of them were, one or two I would consider fairly benign, and I'd be surprised if people were strongly opposed to these speakers. But I'd say the majority of them, that it was very clear that this person was going to come to campus and say something fairly controversial. And the standard method here is you typically ask people, would you support or oppose, or would you allow or not allow this speaker on campus? And one thing we did that was a little different from the standard Stouffer method was, instead of just making it a binary response of allow, not allow, or support, oppose, we had a 4-point scale ranging from strongly support to strongly oppose. But effectively, this is the typical, almost gold standard way. I hesitate to say gold standard necessarily because there's another methodology that one could also use to assess tolerance, but it's one of the two most commonly used ones in the literature on this topic. And so we basically assess them on that.
Well, let's talk about some of those questions. So the question is, would you support or oppose your school allowing a speaker on campus who promotes the following idea? And then we had, I believe, 8 options.
8 different options, yeah.
Abortion should be completely illegal. The U.S. should support Israeli military policy. Transgender people have a mental disorder. Some racial groups are less intelligent than others. Christianity has a negative influence on society. Censoring the news media is necessary. Black Lives Matter is a hate group. All white people are racist. And again, the question was, would you support or oppose your school allowing a speaker on campus who promotes the following idea? So yeah, as you mentioned, controversial stuff, but we've seen in our work that these sorts of speakers often find themselves on campus. And one of the findings from this is actually quite shocking. In every single category, a majority, I should say nearly every single category, a majority of students would somewhat oppose or strongly oppose their school allowing this speaker on campus. Nearly every category. The one category of speaker that students weren't in the majority in opposing allowing them on campus was the speaker that argues that the U.S. should support Israeli military policy. And in that case, it was exactly 50%.
Yeah,
strongly opposed.
It's important to note that was split 50-50. And, sure, U.S. support of Israel is obviously a controversial issue.
particularly at the Ivy League schools.
But yeah, and particularly at the Ivy League and elite schools. But at the end of the day, I mean, that to me strikes me as a fairly benign statement about foreign policy, and that only got 50% approval. Yeah, that's I don't actually even know what to say about that.
Well, Sean, tell me a little bit about the elite schools and this question, because it seems to me that this was kind of a hot debate at the elite schools.
Yeah, so one of the other domains we assessed is
and we can segue to that domain.
Yeah, I'm kind of in a way segueing to that, but it's like, so we also assessed perceived openness or willingness to discuss controversial topics, and with this we listed 8 topics, asked people to identify any of them that whether or not they felt they could have an honest and open conversation on campus about them. And so one of those 8 topics was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's slightly different from Israeli military policy. But what we found was this question is basically, it's not what's the most difficult topic to discuss, because we asked them to just simply identify any topics you find difficult. So more what I'm talking about now is kind of like a frequency count of how many people identified that as a difficult topic. And so across the board, abortion and race were kind of the 2 biggest ones. But there was this really interesting finding in the data whereby at 8 to 10 schools, mainly Ivy League and other elite institutions, so some schools in California, University of Chicago as well, the students most frequently identified, by most frequently, I'm saying the largest percentage of students it was the largest percent on that campus, identified the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as difficult to discuss. And this was borne out in, if one goes through those open-ended comments, you could see at these more elite institutions like the Ivy League schools and a few others, this is reflected in the student open-ended responses as well, where you have people in very much the same way that you see liberals and conservatives talking in these comments. You have people on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian debate essentially saying, "I can't talk about this." The other side will attack me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of, those comments actually paint the picture even more, I think, than what the raw numbers of the data show.
So that top, and we're talking about the openness category, which was another group, and that received equal weight in our rankings as the tolerance category, about the questions about speakers. It received 40% or 40 points. But race, it's no surprise that was a tough topic. People didn't feel super comfortable or talking about that topic on campus. They identified it as challenging. 43% of students did.
And I imagine it would be considerably higher today. Given
after the George Floyd
of
protests.
The summer, as you mentioned in the beginning, we ended this survey basically right before all of the protests started.
So we had 43% of college students identifying that as one topic that was challenging to discuss on campus, but that figure rises to 65% for Black students. So the other kind of category here that was surprising to me was how difficult it was for students to discuss abortion. Abortion was the most commonly identified topic that students found challenging. Right, it's just 1 percentage point above, 44% above, or 45%, excuse me, above race.
Yeah, and there were also some interesting kind of regional, we didn't find too many, I think, regional differences when we looked at the data nationally, but when we started digging into the specific schools, we found some interesting patterns there where abortion was clearly a very sensitive topic at a number of schools that would be considered, quote, in the South by the U.S. Census regions. And race was typically more prominent, again, at kind of similar schools where the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was prominent. And again, I can also say I'll return to kind of those. I really think that the student responses are a very rich source of information for people if you want to spend the time going through them. Both the abortion and race issues, this again is borne out in the comments on race. You often will come across comments of Black students or of people of color commenting on how it's very difficult to discuss these issues when they are clearly either the one or one of the only people of their race and ethnicity in the classroom or on the campus even. With abortion, what I found interesting was at a number of campuses, there were a lot of pro-choice individuals who, in their comments, effectively were conveying that they felt they couldn't discuss this issue because there frequently are pro-life advocates or protesters that kind of show up on campus and are very intimidating to them effectively. Like they stand in the quad or the quote free speech alley or zone, and they can be very intimidating to the students. And so that was I think that's a very rich source of information if you kind of go through those comments and see that.
So those are the two main categories as part of our index, as part of our methodology. But accounting for 8% or 8 points is self-expression.
Yep.
Where students were asked whether they, quote, personally ever felt you could not express your opinion on a subject because of how students, a professor, or the administration would respond. Some interesting stuff here too, Sean, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is effectively, I mean, if you want to, we call it self-expression in there, but this is effectively a question that gets at the concept of self-censorship, which, in academic literature, it's typically defined as, you're not expressing yourself, it's not because you don't feel knowledgeable enough about the topic, because that's kind of a good reason maybe to not express yourself. It's not because of, oh, I'm just not interested in this and I don't really have a dog in this fight. It is the reason or self-censorship, the way it's defined is it's in response to fear of social sanction. So this question is an attempt to get at that. We found that 60% of students could recall at least one incident where this occurred. Again, and so the open-ended responses I've been mentioning they are obtained as a follow-up to this question. So anyone who said, yes, I can recall an instance where I self-censored, they were then asked to describe it. And that's also very rich when you kind of go through these comments. You see a few dominant themes kind of emerge, and I'll say, this is me having gone through these comments. This isn't done with a rigorous content analysis or anything like that. I'd love to do that with this data set and hope to.
And our listeners can go and look at them themselves.
You can go look at them themselves and see if my impressions are fairly accurate, or if you think they're completely off the wall, you can see that too. But what has emerged to me is there's a handful of themes, but there does seem to be this general climate where people there's essentially confirmation for this idea of a spiral of silence on campus, where students are aware of kind of what the dominant opinion is around them, and if their opinion's in the minority, they are far more, they convey that they're far more reluctant to express it, and they often will hide it.
So one of the things we found in the survey is that campuses are predominantly liberal, with a few exceptions, and that our survey responses show that students who identify as Republican are significantly more likely to report a history of self-censorship compared with students who identify as Democrats. So it's 70% for Republicans could recall an instance of self-censorship versus 54%. And if you look at those who strongly identify as Republican versus those who strongly identify as Democrat, the results are even more pronounced.
They get sharper, and I mean, it's very similar results when we compare self-identified conservatives to self-identified liberals.
The other group that is very likely to report an instance of self-censorship was Black or African American students at 63%, which is higher than, of course, the total of 60% for all respondents. And you said you saw in the survey responses, the open-ended responses, that Black or African American students talked about their reluctance to speak up.
Yeah, that was it was fairly common to encounter open-ended responses where students were saying, look, as a minority, as a person of color, as a Black individual at a primarily white institution, it's often very difficult for me to discuss certain things, or displeasure at being, quote, put on the spot as the one person in the class who can speak to some of these concerns,
these experiences.
But I'll also note what was really another thing that was really interesting in going through some of those was, regardless of whether the campus was predominantly liberal or a little bit more mixed, it almost didn't matter what the person's politics were. If they perceived that they were in the minority around them, they said they self-censored. So in terms of volume, there were far more comments about people saying, oh, well, if I go against what the liberals think, I can't say anything, et cetera, or they intimidate me. But that's simply because there's far more liberals on campus, I think.
Yeah.
But there were plenty of comments from left-leaning students or liberal students who effectively said, well, when I'm around a lot of Republicans or a lot of conservatives, like I can't say anything.
Yeah. So I want to move on to the next category now, which is
Yeah.
administrative support, which accounts for 4% of our ranking weights or 4 points. And the administrative support section includes 2 questions. The first one is, does your college administration make it clear to students that free speech is protected on your campus? And, for the most part, students felt that their administrations did. 70% answered yes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually, let me jump in and just say, actually, the self-expression topic that we just discussed is up to 12 points, not 8.
Oh, sorry.
We did. Yeah. I just want to clarify that. But yeah, the majority of students did perceive, and this was noted in a piece yesterday. Inside Higher Ed covered the release of our survey, and they interviewed Lara Schwartz, who's also done some great work in this space, and she made note of the fact that a large percentage of students do perceive their administration as being supportive of free speech and free expression, and making efforts to establish that culture on campus. And I think kind of what that maybe suggests is maybe the issue is more with the other students and those interactions than anything to do with like administrative policy. That might be far more of the area where we might need to focus on, and that involves maybe developing more of a culture of free speech versus just having specific policies on the books.
The other question, which kind of is where the rubber hits the road, I should maybe say, is if there were a controversy surrounding offensive speech, would your administration come to the speaker's defense? Mm-hmm. And I'm pulling up the question here. I've moved in my document, so I'm no longer at it.
It was lower, I would say. I think that one was between like 55 and 60% overall, if I remember.
Yeah, so it was question 21. If a controversy over offensive speech were to occur on your campus, would the administration be more likely to defend the speaker's right to express their views or punish the speaker for making the statement? And 57% of students said defend the speaker's right to express their views. That's a majority, but it's still concerning that 41% of students responded that the administration would punish the speaker for making the statement.
Well, and I think it also perhaps shows a little bit of a disconnect where you have 70% saying the administration makes it very clear that they're going to support free speech, free expression, etc. But then, as you just said, when the rubber hits the road, reduced percentage of students, like certainly still a majority, but it's definitely lower, actually think they will follow through on those promises that they've made.
Yeah, so pretty concerning stuff. And I want to get to the last category, and then I want to look at some of the other data. The last category here is, of course, the Fire Speech Code. It's not only important what students perceive their campus environment to be like, but it's also important whether these campuses actually maintain policies or speech codes that do not comport with First Amendment standards and can be used to censor students. And that accounted for, what was it, Sean? Do you remember?
So it can account for you can either a school that has a green light rating will get 4 points added to their score. You get 0 for a yellow, and you will lose points. You'll lose 4 points for having a red or a warning. So it accounts for a range of 8.
Yeah, and so green light means you maintain no policies that can be used that can censor students or that don't meet First Amendment standards, or and then yellow light means that some of the policies are iffy and could be interpreted to violate First Amendment standards, and then red means they clearly and substantially restrict or burden speech. So we've talked about our spotlight rating on the show many times. We don't need to go too in depth to it, but on the rankings we list what the ranking is, or the rating is for each school.
Yeah, and I'll add, we actually did this is the only component of the score that wasn't part of the survey. I mean, the fire ratings are work that Fire's done separately. They've been around for a long time. We tested a number of different models. I'm not going to really go into the nitty gritty of the statistics here because I don't think it's like the right forum for that. But we tested the fit of a number of different models, some that included the fire ratings, some that did not. We found a model that fit well, that demonstrated that they accounted for it. It did explain a little bit of the variance. It had an impact. It had an effect. So we're confident that they should be included. But as you could see by the way the scores are laid out, openness and tolerance are the major components here. And those traditionally have long been known as things that are important to free speech. And so the fire rating, while yes, it statistically is a notable component, it's still not worth that much for the overall score. But we verified that it's worth including.
Yes. If anyone wants to interview Sean about his statistical analyses, feel free to give him a ring. Anyway, the last two topics I want to talk about, well, I guess the first presidential debate happened last night, so let's start there. We asked some questions about President Trump, former Vice President Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and one of the findings was astounding. Nearly 1/3 of students don't think Trump should be allowed to speak on campus. And that's 22% for Biden. Bernie had the highest support for being allowed to speak on campus at 87%. So it was only 13% who didn't think he should be allowed. But kind of shocking stuff. The president of the United States, nearly 1/3 of people don't think he should be allowed on campus.
Yeah. So, I'll say these, the questions about Trump and Biden, Bernie, we also asked about Rush Limbaugh. And we also asked about dating Trump. None of these actually go into the rankings.
Not dating Trump, but dating a Trump supporter.
Yeah, these were more current event questions that we included because we knew they'd be interesting to look at. I will note, actually, Nico, that even though 1/3 don't support Trump coming on campus, it seems like based on our data, they are at least noting that, well, he is the president and he should be allowed because Rush Limbaugh actually had the lowest level of support.
Oh, wow. I'm surprised a lot of students
so they
know
are
who Rush
giving him
Limbaugh
a little,
is.
they are noting that, well, it is the president. Maybe we, probably, even if we don't like him, probably should, maybe let him come here and say what he's going to say. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, I find that but I find the figure for that. And to me, the Biden one is actually even a little more surprising. 22% sounds low, but 22% of our sample of almost 20,000 people is a lot of students. And if we roughly approximate and say this is a decent approximation for what students in general across the country may think, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people who basically think Joe Biden should not be on campus. And that to me is actually even more surprising than the Trump thing. I actually kind of would have thought the Trump thing would have been higher.
You mentioned dating a Trump supporter. Yeah. So 55% of people who disapprove. So we asked people, if they approve or disapprove of President Donald Trump. 55% of people who disapprove of Donald Trump say it would be impossible or very difficult to date a Trump supporter. So a majority of people who disapprove of Donald Trump would find it impossible or very difficult to date a Trump supporter. On the other end, 11% of people who approve of Trump say it would be impossible or very difficult to date a Trump opponent. So kind of shocking there.
Yeah, and so I'll note, just to make sure everyone's aware, if you said you approve of Trump, you got the question about dating someone who disapproves, and if you said you disapprove, you get the question about et cetera. Each person only got one of those questions. It's a pretty shocking. On its face, it seems like shocking. It's actually fairly consistent with some other polling data that's been done. Both through Pew asked a question about this at one point. I believe the Voter Study Group also asked something like this at one point. And this split is actually fairly consistent with what other polls have found. Those polls were not of college students, of course. They were more of the general public. But it found a very similar split. If people disapprove of Trump, they are far more likely to say it's very difficult to impossible, or that they flat out wouldn't date a Trump supporter. And then on the flip side, the percentage of people who approve of Trump saying they wouldn't be able to, be with someone who's an opponent of him is typically a bit lower. So it's like, in a way, it's like shocking because it's kind of huge, and it shows maybe that the Trump approvers might be a little more open-minded on this issue here. But
yeah, Now we're running out of
it's actually not that surprising when you note that other polling outfits have found something similar.
I want to close up here by talking about some of the heckler's veto questions that we have in the survey.
Yeah.
Now, these were shocking to me. We found that while a large majority of students say that violent tactics are never acceptable when protesting campus speakers, almost 1 in 5 consider using violence to stop a speech or other event on campus as either always, sometimes, or rarely acceptable. 1% said always, 3% said sometimes, I think it's 13% said rarely. But, even if you rarely think violence is acceptable to stop a speech on campus, I mean, in those cases, probably the more extreme speakers. That's still pretty significant, and students at Ivy League schools were actually slightly more in favor of using violence to stop a campus speech, with a total of 21% saying always, sometimes, or rarely. Did this surprise you, Sean?
It did on some levels, and on other levels, the figure of right around 20% is fairly consistent with prior data collected on this. So there's been a number of, over the last 4 or 5 years, I think this has become a question that has been interesting, and there's been a number of different outfits that have polled it. One of FIRE's earlier surveys strictly asked, would you commit violence? So would you personally do it? And 1% said yes. But when you phrase it kind of the way we did on this survey, asking about, well, is it okay if someone does it? It doesn't necessarily have to be you. Just if someone does it, would you consider that acceptable? When people have asked it that way, that typically finds 15 to 20% of students saying, well, yeah, this is acceptable. Again, I would, taking it out of the context of the percentage seems to fit prior data, I find it very concerning for the same reasons that I brought up about the Biden question. It's when you think about how many college students there are in the country, 20%, if this is a rough and fairly accurate approximation, that's a lot. Again, a lot of students see this as acceptable. Maybe, again, most of them maybe only in rare cases, but I see there being a very big difference from saying never and rarely.
Minorities have a way of, and when I say minorities, I mean it as the number of people have a way of shaping discourse on campus. It's usually a minority of students who are willing to engage in a heckler's veto and willing to shout down a speaker, block an entrance to a campus event. But let's say you have just 1 in 5. So you say you have 20 students. That's enough to really foil an event.
Yeah.
If, we're talking about, 20 out of 100. And then you amplify that, across the, some of these student populations, which at Indiana, I remember it was 30,000 students.
Yeah. Some of these campuses, 20% or 50, even if it's only 15% on that campus. Well, when you have 30,000 or more undergraduates enrolled, that is still a significant number of people. I think we see through other data that's been collected out there, the Hidden Tribes group, or the Hidden Tribes report from More in Common has hit on this a bit, their research project. They've done some follow-ups on that. They've hit on, look, the extremes on both the left and the right are a small percentage of people, but they're often the loudest.
Yep.
And it seems like they tend to drive and dominate much of the conversation.
So we asked 4 questions about this, and we said, so the meat of the question was, how acceptable would you say it is for students to engage in the following action to protest a campus speaker? We asked them, blocking other students from entering a campus event, shouting down a speaker or trying to prevent them from speaking on campus, using violence to stop a speech or event on campus, and then tearing down a flyer, removing flyers or other advertisements for an upcoming speaker or event on campus. These are all things we've seen happen on campus. Some pretty surprising results here, especially when you break it down by Ivy Leagues or liberal or conservative. More than 60% of extreme liberals say it's always or sometimes acceptable to shout down a speaker, compared to 15% for extreme conservatives. 37% of Ivy League students say that shouting down a speaker is always or sometimes acceptable, compared to 26% of students not enrolled in Ivy League colleges. On removing flyers, it's 37% for Ivy Leagues, 28% for non-Ivy League colleges. And then there was almost 1 in 5 Ivy League students find it always or sometimes acceptable to block other students from entering a campus event, compared to roughly 1 in 10 for non-Ivy League. So some pretty shocking findings here. Sean, how were these or were these not incorporated into the overall ranking?
So the protest questions are not incorporated into the overall rankings. The models we ran, those weren't, quote, part of a good fitting model. But we talk about them in the report because I think, and I know Fire thinks it's very concerning, some of these figures. But yeah, they are not actually in the overall ranking or score.
Yeah.
But I still think the figures, even for tearing down flyers, are concerning.
Yeah, they tell you something about the climate.
Well, so I was just gonna say, I recall there was one of the open-ended comments, and it may actually not be on the dashboard because I'm not remembering correctly or not if it had kind of like too much identifying information, but the gist of it was effectively the school tried to punish us for ripping down flyers advertising this event.
And the student presumably thought that was an exercise of their free expression to remove or vandalize other
not
people's
realizing
flyers.
that by doing that you're kind of infringing on other people's ability to even be aware of this event and hopefully attend it. So I'm not sure if that one actually appears in our dashboard because I'm given the gist of the quote, and I actually think it was removed because there was it was a little too specific. It was like this school tried to punish us for doing this, and reveal it's like you could find out who that is probably.
Yeah.
But the gist of the comment was effectively, "Oh, this is okay."
We need to leave it here because I gotta head to a meeting.
Sure.
But for our listeners, we're going to continue diving in. There's so much in this survey, largest ever survey of college students about free speech ever conducted. You incorporate the ratings into that. You have the open-ended questions that Sean has been talking about throughout this conversation. There's just a lot of meat here. And Sean on our news desk blog at thefire.org. Is going to be digesting and digging deeper into some of these and providing more analysis, including comparisons to pre-existing studies in the coming weeks and months. And like I said at the top of the show, we look forward to hopefully expanding the survey. 55 colleges now. There's been talk of doing it for 200, 250. We'll see. It's kind of an expensive project. So the choice is not entirely mine. But
if it was up to us, I think we'd already be doing that.
Yeah, well, I kind of need a vacation first. I'm sure you do too.
We'd be making, that would be ramping up the start. I mean, yes, our goal is to. We would love to continue. We would love to do this again and kind of continue to do this. And through doing it, we hope to get really good feedback on our measures and what we're asking about, et cetera. And, we're very open to, hey, maybe we should also ask a question about this or we should assess that. We look at this kind of as the start of assessing this. We encourage other people to also try to assess campuses in this way. And we look at it really as like kind of the start of the conversation of how to get our heads around this problem.
Yeah, it's the beta test of sorts. But Sean, I really appreciate you coming on the show, talking a little bit about it. And, again, for our listeners who want to learn more, you can follow Sean's commentary on Fire's blog at thefire.org and visit speech.collegepulse.com to really dig into the data. You can download the report. It's a 67-page report. You can play with the interactive dashboard to look at all the different schools' rankings, their various variables. Then for those schools, you can search by enrollment size, by cost, by conference, by distance from your home. And then there's an insights tab that allows you to dig into the data for each particular question. So speech.collegepulse.com. All this information is also available on Fire's website at thefire.org, as well as some of the past student surveys that we've done. We did 3 previous national surveys of students. So check that out. And Sean, again, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This podcast is hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. You can learn more about So to Speak by following us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. We take email feedback if you need to get in touch with me at so to speak @thefire.org. Those emails do go to me. I see them all. So I appreciate, and we'll try to respond to any questions or comments that we receive. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. That's one of the best ways that we can attract listeners to the show. So until next time, thanks again for listening.